YouTube? It's Austin ship with Rack City MTG coming at you with a video where I will be analyzing the possibility of playing some sort of discard tribal deck akin to Rack in Pioneer. In the past, I think I've mentioned it on the channel. The reason why it's so difficult to play 8 Rack, even with Shrieking Affliction legal in the format, in Pioneers. One, obviously, we don't have the rack, and Davriel and Liliana Wicker the Dead really on their own are not nearly as powerful as the rack, and the rack is, at least in my opinion, much more powerful, especially with the printing of Urza Saga, but even before that, was much more powerful than the Shrieking Affliction. So the biggest secondary reason to that, though, is that we've not had a repeatable source of card disadvantage. And that's what you've seen me starting on Raven's Crime right here. Raven's Crime is probably the most underrated card in an 8 rack shell. Um, I think it's almost always wrong not to run 4 of this card because if you, unless you're running some sort of creature threats late game, all an opponent really has to do is hold on to their spells and hold on to their not play land drops, and they'll keep from taking damage off the rack. And if you don't have a Raven's Crime effect where you can make them discard cards even if they are lands being held, you're really going to struggle to keep them to the point where they're taking damage off of your rack effects. Now, you probably have heard this news at this point if you played any 8 rack at all, and maybe you're excited for it because maybe it allows you to play 8 rack with the full for Liliana of the Veils in Modern. Yep, that's right. She's getting reprinted at in this. She's still at Mythic, so for us that own her, it's probably not going to completely tank her value. I think she was sitting at $70 or $80 a copy there even recently, but hopefully for you all that are just now getting into 8 rack, it can get down to about $30 or $40 a copy at its dip here. That would be fantastic. That would allow people to maybe play 8 rack that haven't gotten to play or have been on a budget and playing a less optimized version get to play with the full 4 Lilianas. But what that also means is we now have a repeatable discard engine in Pioneer, and we've not had that before outside of Liliana Wicker of the Dead. Um, and not to mention, this now kind of gives us that second option for that repeatable discard engine. So what we're going to do today, we're going to look at two of the lists so far I've been brewing for a Pioneer. 8 racks obviously not really the correct term for it, but we'll just say discard tribal. So let's look at our first list here. I'll I'll post the tapped out links in the descriptions if you want to comment on the tapped out links. That's perfectly fine as well. Doesn't bother me any. It's just I've had the same tapped out profile for years and years now, so you're welcome to check it out. It's mostly janky brews on my end though, so don't if you go through, don't take a lot of the deck lists made as like, oh man, maybe I should try this out. Trust me, a lot of them were just me messing around or coming up with something fun for F&M. So, but these two specifically, I brewed with the idea of a potential competitive discard deck in Pioneer. As you'll notice, one of the things I've decided to do for now a 2-2 split on the Hive of the Eye Tyrant and Mutavault. That's mostly because I'm not sure which one is better. Um, Mutavault is much more efficient, but as we'll go over later, having graveyard hate right now in Pioneer is probably the most important thing for an 8 rack deck or a discard deck to succeed because there are so many good graveyard oriented decks, or at least graveyard decks that use the graveyard for a significant amount of value. And if you don't have the ability to interact with their graveyard main deck, I don't think you're going to be able to win many games as a discard deck because there's just too many. You have Treasure Cruise is a big one, Arclight Phoenix. You have the uh, Greasefang decks, and you have the Croxa style decks too, or in the sometimes they run Dreadhorde Arcanist, and that's just some of the ones. But Treasure Cruise and Dig Through Time are kind of the big cards that you have to be able to hit on the graveyard just a little bit to slow those cards down. And like I said, Phoenix can be a problem if you don't address that, but that's our land sweep. Because we're running so many of the Planeswalkers and we are running Rankles, I think Takenuma is actually better in this deck than it is in most decks. And it's already kind of free as a one of. I wouldn't say completely free because it does limit Castle Lockdwayne. If you'll notice too, I'm not running an Herb Organ here. I always forget that that card is technically Pioneer legal. We definitely want to run at least one Herb Org. Maybe we run 2 to 3. I don't think we need to run 4, especially considering there's no smallpox or Raven's Crime now, and that those are two cards that really like let you kind of get away with running the full 4 board. But that's something I need to look into. Some of these, so just keep that in mind. Some of these swamps, and after I post this video, I'll have decided on how to adjust it. So if you go to the link, I'm leaning on 2 right now, and because I'm leaning on 2 with that, I may even increase the number of one of these two up 1. But yeah, so the Takenuma, as of right now, just as a one of, I would cut a spell if I was going to add that. Notice we're on 20 lands, which is a pretty low land count for 8 rack style deck, but we're not really discarding or sacrificing lands as much with ourselves. We're really more of a 2 for 1 use style deck, and one of the cards that you'll notice is missing from this list in particular. There might be some other cards that you're thinking that would be good in a discard deck that aren't in this list, but are in my other list. But the big one missing is Shrieking Affliction. I don't think that we have efficient enough. Really, the only powerful discard spell we have in the format's Thoughtseize, right? And now Liliana of the Veil will be in the format. So those are the only 2 cards that really are powerful enough to play around an enchantment that just gives us that. But we don't have, there's no Funeral Charms, there's no Raven's Crime, there's no Black Veils, there's nothing else really that's 1 mana that's extremely playable right now. But those are your options. So we might consider adding some later and having a more traditional option, but I don't think we need it, honestly. I think that we really want to be more mid-rangey than we are or than we are relying on our rack effects. We're still a discard tribal deck. Some of the cards that are neat to run in this list, obviously, we're running the one of Liliana the Last Hope because the next card that I'm getting ready to demonstrate here, the Liliana's Triumph. So if we can make this card a 2 for 1, this card is one of the best edicts in the entire format. If we can hold on and let it there be, we have 9 Lilianas that can be in play. So when this card is a 2 for 1, this card is actually extremely good. It's almost good enough for modern. It's probably not quite unless you're playing a smallpox-less deck with like 8 Lilianas. Then maybe you can consider this in the main deck of modern. But for the most part, this is a Pioneer card, and it really does add that extra one. It gets through a ley line of Sanctity. I don't think you'll see that often in Pioneer, but it is legal in Pioneer, so it's just a thought. So you do have the Liliana's Triumph. It gets around a ley line, gets around. I think Veil of Summer is banned, but it would in Modern it gets around Veil of Summer. It does a lot of work for 2 mana. It could potentially be a 2 for 1. The easiest card to run is 4 Fatal Push. The only downside with Fatal Push in this list is I don't think it's worth running Fabled Passages in a monocolored deck just to make Fatal Push a little bit better. But there are other ways that we can trigger Revolt pretty easily with Fatal Push, such as chump blocking or Planeswalker dying or us sacrificing one of these creatures or chump blocking one of these creatures. So it's not impossible to trigger Revolt. It's just less easy than it is in Modern, and especially the other deck that we're going to show here in a minute. 2 Unlicensed Hearse, like I mentioned earlier, this is just, I've been meaning to post a Modern 8-rack video for a while now where I go over, I've been running 2 of this card main deck, and I'm not sure if that's going to be a permanent thing, but the value that it can get is just it scales perfectly well to the game, and it synergizes very well with Mishra's Factory. And I've been actually running one of Nether Spirit again in Modern. So when you factor in Mishra's Factory and Nether Spirit in Modern, all of a sudden now you have this card that minimizes the graveyard and is this huge threat late game that can. It's another plan B or C, and it also, while it's just sitting there, it makes our saga tokens bigger. So it just adds another element to Modern. I think it's going to perform just as well, if not better, in Pioneer. Two might be low, but I don't think it's as easy for us to just immediately crew it. And this might be a reason to lean more into the Mutavaults than the Hive of the Eye Tyrants, because it's a lot easier to, like, Hive of the Eye Tyrant, you really have to be at 5 lands before this card is remotely activatable. So that I think that might be what I lean more towards is the Mutavaults, and hoping the Urborgs kind of balance some of the Mutavaults downside out a little bit. And we'll probably, like I said, this list will look a little bit different by the time you all see it, but because it is in the beta phase right now. But that's kind of the benefit of running Hearse and Mutavault together. The Planeswalker suite, I'm not convinced for Davriel is where you want to be at all. It is a semi-repeatable source of discard, right? And it is a pretty bad version of the rack, but it's not a horrible Magic card by any means. I wouldn't even have considered it in there as a four of, but just saying what some of the downsides of it are, it's just not particularly amazing. If it can be a 2-for-1 or even a 3-for-1 and be able to play a second one right after it against control decks, that's really the best spot that it can perform at. But against aggro decks, usually you play it. It's 3 mana. You downtick it once. They definitely have a way to deal 2 damage to it before you know it. And it's a 2-for-1 in that if they had to cast a like play with fire, it's a 2-for-1 to kill it. But if they attack it with a creature, it was just a pretty bad 3 mana 1-for-1 that discarded their worst card. So I'm not completely sold on this. It's probably one that you board out against aggro decks, but keep in against control decks. So because of that, I think that 4 might be a little bit too high, but just for the sake of what we're doing today, we're going to have it at 4. Liliana of the Veil, obviously, this is the easy 4 of for this style of deck. We'll look at some of the other popular decks in Pioneer right now that might slot this card in their deck, but for us, this is a easy 4-0, I think. At worst, it's a 1-for-1. At best, it takes over the game very, very quickly. And if you've played Modern enough, you know that. So, not a whole lot much more to say about Liliana of the Veil outside. It's probably not as strong in Pioneer as it was in Modern about 10 years or so ago, but it's probably stronger than it is in Modern right now. So, that's a positive. Liliana Waker of the Dead. You probably remember this coming out in 21. It does. It has its own kind of self-contained rack effect, and that when it plus ones, if the opponent can't discard a card, they take 3. So it's not as good as a rack, but it is a repeatable source of card, uh, or making your opponent discard cards and yourself for its own -3 ability, which is actually more important. It's really important that it goes by our graveyard, not our opponent's graveyard, because we really have to have a lot of graveyard hate in this deck and other rack decks. So it synergizes on a couple different levels with our deck. I do think that this one, if you're running actual discard tribal and not like a mono black mid range, I think this is always going to be a 4 of in your list. And here's the Liliana the Last Hope. It's kind of just a flex spot. Makes our Liliana's Triumphs a little bit better and is good against aggro decks, or it even like it's -2 can grind values with our Rankles and Burglar Rats, and it can also just has a legitimately game-winning ultimate, especially against control decks where there's really not a whole lot your opponent's going to be able to do once that emblem gets online. Looking at our sorceries, Go Blink's the big one. I think if you're going to run this style of deck, you have to run 4 Go Blink because of the graveyard hate. It's not perfect by any means. It's a 3 mana 2-for-1, which is like that's baseline for a rack deck. Uh, We want our 1 mana's. We only want our only 1 for 1 to be 1 mana. If it's 2 mana or up, we really need it to either be a threat or a 2 for 1. So 4 go blanks, pretty easy as far as like we're going to exile their graveyard. We have 4 Thoughtseize because, like I said, this is really the only good 1 mana discard spell in the format. There are others, but they're just not. Just being honest, they're just not very good. You can run Dreadfuge, which is the closest thing we have to Inquisition of Kozilek, but I just think that it's better for us in this format to go bigger instead of trying to be hyper efficient. Because if the opponent resolves something like an Asika's Chariot and we have a bunch of Dreadfuges in hand, we're just gonna lose very quickly. So it really is more about grinding that 2 for 1 value late game than it is the quick, efficient early game in this particular format. We are running a 2 of Unburden. I've debated on what is the best because we do need a second sorcery 2 for 1 discard spell. I settled on Unburden just because it does have the upside of late game. If you're in a top decking battle, you get to cycle this thing away, and it provides that extra bit of card advantage that way. So, like I said, we're in a format where, and especially as a discard deck, if we're trying to get them low or empty on resources quickly, we do kind of benefit from when we top deck a Thoughtseize in Modern, for example. If we can't, there's no point in casting it, we might discard it to Liliana or something of the sort. But this one's even better in that we get to cycle it. So it, it's not great, but it does its job. I don't think it's as good as Go Blank, but we'll take it. And the creature suite, so you can run Virus Beetle, and there's a few other ones, but I think Rat, the Burglar Rat, for a couple reasons, it doesn't hits each opponent, so it gets through once again any sort of player hexproof effects. And two, Rat's not a very common creature type, so if someone just happens to be running something that hurts a specific creature type for some reason, this makes it a little bit harder. And it's better than Virus Beetle, I think, because Virus Beetle is an artifact and it keeps our opponent from being able to 2 for 1 us with like a Colgan's command where they kill our Mutavault and destroy our artifact Virus Beetle, or 2 for 1 us as easily. So those are the reasons why Burglar Rat over other cards. There might be a better 2 mana 1/1 that makes each opponent discard a card out there, but I've not seen it. I think there's probably several cards that do this effect, and maybe you want to run some split of them so that there's not really any meddling mage effects that I know of in the format. But it might be right to technically run 2 of this and 2 of something else. But just for now, 4 Burglar Rat seems fine. It doesn't seem like there's any reason not to. This is something that might seem interesting, but all 4 copies of Rankle Master of Pranks. This is a card that I played a lot of mono black aggro when Pioneer first came out, and I would always see people wanting to run just 2 or 3 copies of this card because it was legendary. But it's until you play it, you really don't realize how much it just absolutely takes over a game. So it does have the each player discards effect, and really I consider this. I played this card as a 2 of in my modern sideboard at one point when it first came out years ago now, and actually my very first 5-0 with Rack. This was in Rankle was in the main deck of a modern Rack deck. So to give you an idea, I have a very high opinion of the power level of this card. It like I said, Flying Haste. If you've not seen it or played it before, it does at least 3 damage. You can have it do up to 4 damage if you like. It can be a card advantage effect that reignites your discard spells and makes your discard spells good again after you're both top decking, while also being able to keep that card advantage. So it can keep you from losing card advantage by having these discard spells late game, which is an underrated aspect of it. It can sacrifice itself if you need it to, especially if you're under the impression of, okay, like I have the second Wrinkle in hand, I'm going to hit them, make them sacrifice their threat. And because of all these things are symmetrical, and or even like the reason why we're playing specifically a creature with this is so that we have that extra creature if we want to start playing the Rankle Edict game to sacrifice 2 Rankle. So it's just this extra little value that you can squeak out with this card. You can discard extra wrinkles with its ability if you have multiple stuck in hand. It just running this as a four of, it's the same thing that happened with Hazaret back when it was in standard. People see legendary and they think, I can't run that card as a four of. And the answer is absolutely you can and you should. it whenever you have the ability to get value out of the extra copies and the copy itself is already busted, I think this is a pretty easy four of for this mono black shell. Quickly, we're going to look at the sideboard and we're going to Graveyard Trespasser. It's just a pretty good threat. It's almost good enough for modern. You've seen some of the videos where I've played it in modern. It's not quite. It can do work. It's probably not quite as good as Dothi Voidwalker, but man, it sure does give really good two for ones. It's a really great sideboard threat if you are trying to play this grindy game against control decks. Ward is a great mechanic with the discard card because it's not like with Bone Crusher Giant or things like that where it has to be targeted by a spell. It's spell, ability, anything. It triggers Ward. So if they want to bounce it with a Teferi, they got to now discard a card. So it completely negates their card advantage from bouncing it. So there's a lot of really powerful things about this card that I think makes it one of the best threats. I think it makes it a little bit better than Pack Rat, for example, as a sideboard threat. Did decide to run Cletus instead of the full four Graveyard Trespassers. Cletus is one that it is legendary and it's powerful in the same way that Rankle is, but I don't think it's really better as Graveyard Hate and playing in that way. And here's now me thinking about it, talking about it. Here's another reason to go the full four Mutavault because that's three sacrifice another vampire or zombie ability actually can uh, sacrifice Mutavaults to that ability. So it can grow pretty far out of range of burn spells. Revolted Fatal Push is really the only thing in the format that takes care of it easily, but it's another just good card. It's good against mono red aggro decks like that because of the life gain. It's hard to kill with four toughness. It's just a solid one of in your lists. It might be worth running it one of in the main deck as well. Languish, just an extra board wipe. There's a lot of the three mana negative two effects, but from what I've seen in Pioneer, negative four is so much better than negative two because that helps you clean up Parhelion tokens, Grease Fangs. Like I said, there are some that exile negative two if you're really concerned about Phoenix specifically. But as we're going to look at right below it, we have the four Leyline of the Voids for Phoenix. So it's less concerning when we're playing against Phoenix. We have the Go Blanks and we have the Leyline of the Voids and we have the Unlicensed Hearse. That should give us a chance to beat that deck most games, I think. Two Obnoxious Grasp, it's just good for against the mono green Planeswalkers style ramp deck, and it's good against blue white control, and it's good against Esper, or not Esper, but excuse me, Abzan. I think it's the more popular version of Greasefang now. So it just has a lot of utility for a two mana removal spell that is specifically two colors. It ends up hitting like about half the format, so it's a very underrated sideboard card. Legion's End would be the other card that you might consider running instead of this, but given the current meta, I think this is the one that you want to run. Three Pithing Needle, I was back and forth between this and Phyrexian Revoker. Phyrexian Revoker's downside is that it makes your blue-white control players, or any control player for that matter, or burn players, targeted removal spells turned on. So I think for now, we're going to stick with the Pithing Needles. They're mostly just for planeswalkers. If we're playing against a deck that we know has planeswalkers that just outgrind us, well, here's our Pithing Needles. Some other cards that you might consider are Sorin the Merciless for us. It's a solid two for one, typically whenever it comes into play. So that might be something to consider running. If we ever get to the point where we think that we only need four of these sorcery two for ones, maybe that becomes like one Sorin the Mirthless, and maybe even one Shrieking Affliction or like an extra Burglar Rat effect. But that's this list. This is the mono black discard. The one that I think might be better than this, and I saved it for second because it really isn't uh, anything that looks remotely like your traditional discard tribal decks. And I've been calling it Doom Rack because it's really built more around this card here, Doom Foretold. In my opinion, this is the most underplayed card in the Pioneer format. I've played it to Mythic and Explorer and Historic on Arena and just dominated with this suite of cards. It does so much. It can often be when you build around this card, it can also often be like a 6 or 7 for 1 or more. It just if you've not seen it before, at the beginning of each player's upkeep, they sacrifice a non-land, non-token permanent. If they can't for whatever reason, then it becomes like a 3 for 1, 4 for 1, where they discard a card, you draw a card, you drain them for 2, and you get a 2/2. So at its worst, if there's nothing in play for them, all of a sudden it just becomes this massive piece of card advantage. At its best, it just has this weird braids effect where it just grinds them into oblivion. So because of this card, cards like Oath of Kaya, that's basically a lightning helix with a lot of upside, mind you, becomes very, very good. So you can kill their creature, gain 3 life, you have a Doom Foretold on board the next turn. Now all of a sudden, all right, they sacrifice their other creatures. A lot of times, if you come back to your turn, then Doom Foretold counts itself, so you would have to just sack your Doom Foretold, and that's the end of the value train. But now you sacrifice this Oath of Kaya, and you keep your engine going. You keep playing these little enchantments or other things that will keep Doom Foretold's engine going until they're out of resources, and you get that huge swingy play where they discard, you draw, and you get a creature out of it, and you drain them. It's a very powerful suite of Magic cards. This combined with the card Treacherous Blessing, for example, is extremely, extremely powerful. Treacherous Blessing is a one of the few 3 mana draw threes, especially when you're in this sort of deck. And the other thing that makes these, and of course, to give you an idea, Shrieking Affliction would be a 4 of on this deck list. I don't know. Well, after we play it, we might decide it's not, but it's one of those things that at its worst, it can just be sacrificed away to Doom Foretold when it's not doing anything. So I think there's a lot of upside with running Shrieking Affliction here. Maybe this goes down to 2 when we go up to the full 4 Birth of Meletus, because Birth of Meletus does so much. It's basically the Pioneer version of Wall of Omens, maybe even a little bit better. So big fan of this card. Meat Hook Massacre is the board wipe of choice, just because mainly well, it can get us up in life whenever we kill some of their creatures, but also against, once again, control decks, things where its negative ability is not something we want. Now all of a sudden, we have this 2 mana thing to dump and play that we can just sacrifice to a Doom Foretold. So it's surprisingly synergistic, and it's a powerful card on its own. When you add those extra synergies, it's like I said, it always looks better than what it, or always performs better than what it looks. There's a reason why it's like a $45, $60 card on here. It's even saying so. It's a very powerful card. Trial of Ambition is just a edict that can be. One of the other things to notice is like Trial of Ambition, Oath of Kaya, Birth of Meletus, Treacherous Blessings. All of those can be flickered by your Yorion. So it adds an extra layer of value when you can play this long late game that you just go over the top. So I've played a different version of this deck for a long time in these formats now, and I think that it is a surprisingly powerful shell. And though it's not traditionally what you think of when you think of a discard tribal deck, I think this might be the better version of the discard tribal. And this also lets us play Waste Not, because once again, we can just sacrifice it away if we need to. Because we're running Yorion too, there's all these spots that maybe we would run in a 60 card list. So we get to once again have the full 4 Davriel, who now is much better because we can down tick him twice. And if he gets blinked by Yorion, he's got 2 more activations again. Liliana the same way. You can get the situation where you edict their creature, then you play the Yorion. Now Liliana's back at 3 loyalty. And Liliana Waker of the Dead, same thing. The -3 can kill a creature. All of a sudden now you're back ahead. This list, we just have 1 Rankle, and it's only because Rankle doesn't really do anything synergistic with this deck. It might even be worth taking it out for another one of these enchantments, but I think it's not a bad idea to have one creature threat in your main deck, especially one that can also double as an edict spell if you need it to. So it's powerful enough, I think, that we can keep it as a one of, even though it's not really built around here. So lands, this is the suite that I have so far. The Fabled Passage works really well with the plains and swamps. We don't really need the Castle Locked lands, and we might need a Hive of the Eye Tyrant or something like that for late game, but we don't need Castle Locked lands because these cards just generate such an insane amount of card advantage. In a pro tip, if you're playing this deck, the Fabled Passages, you almost always, if you can, you want to fetch out the swamps because the Birth of Meletus fetches out basic planes, and you never want to run out of basic planes for your Birth of Meletus, especially when you're blinking it or running it in multiples. It's not as important if you're only running two, but if you're running three or four, that's really important to keep in mind. Sorcery is something that maybe we need to consider for the sideboard of the other deck. That is Collective Brutality, which is pretty big here. It's one of the best like defenses against burn style decks in the format, or in modern as well. But it also has utility against control decks as well. So it's just a good little two of that hedges. It's like extra fatal pushes. When you're running a Yorion list, you have to run more than just four fatal pushes as your targeted creature removal for the early game. Just two go blanks in this list. It's just mostly here in this one specifically for the graveyard hate. There's a card called, I think it's Elspeth Conquers. Well, not El. There's two different. It's Elspeth's Nightmare is the one I'm thinking of. Elspeth Conquers Death is good as well, but Elspeth's Nightmare kills a creature, then duresses, or kills a creature with two or less, then duresses them, then exiles their graveyard. That might be worth it running over Go Blank. I think that Elspeth's Nightmare is a bit too slow for Pioneer compared to when I play Historic and Explore. Explore is a little bit slower than Pioneer, not tremendously, but a little bit. So I think the Go Blank is just its speed of exiling the graveyard is what makes it a little bit better, but that might change as we go forward. The sideboard, of course, Yorion has to be part of your sideboard, but we have two Collective Brutalities going up to the full four. Once again, it's mostly just an extra hedge against aggro decks, but if we, for example, against blue white control, we might sideboard it in. I don't think there's a whole lot of blue white control in Pioneer right now, but everyone always is trying to play control. Um, and something to know about Oath of Kaya, I don't think I mentioned this, because now that I see Kaya Orzhov Usurper down here, this card, whenever an opponent attacks a Planeswalker you control, it deals 2 damage to them and you gain 2 life. That can generate a surprising amount of value pretty quickly. So especially against a red deck where they're seeing like, oh, our opponent brought the Kaya Urzhov Usurper and it's gaining them 2 life every turn. I better attack it. And the best feeling ever has been they've attacked the Kaya with the Oath of Kaya in play. They got drained for 2 more, and then I fatal pushed the creature that was attacking. So it was just like they didn't get the damage from attacking. They got the extra life gain for me by attacking the Planeswalker, and they didn't even do any damage to the Planeswalker. So it's very much so this card with Planeswalkers and with blink effects and sacrifice effects. I know a 3 mana Lightning Helix on an enchantment doesn't look like anything special. But when you factor in all of the synergies, it really can just pull away with games, even against control decks where it's been blinked or reused 2 or 3 times. It just because it can go to the face too, it can race. It has a lot of good utilities. Um, this sideboard, I do have the full four graveyard trespassers, just because it's nice to be able to opponent takes out all their creature removal. Here you play not only, or it takes out a lot of their creature removal. Here now you play this card that it will punish them for even trying to remove it. So it's almost hexproof usually when it comes in out of the sideboard. Not always. Sometimes people aren't paying attention to keep their removal spells in, but it's still a 2-for-1 when it gets targeted. So it's a pretty safe for a. I'm going to bring this card in out of my sideboard as a creature. Kaya Orzhov Usurper. Just went over that. It's just a solid graveyard hate, exile 1 mana permanents, life gain. It does its job against both control decks and aggro decks and graveyard decks. So a little bit of everything with that card. Maybe it replaces some number of Davriels eventually in the main deck, or that, or the card Wandering Emperor, which I've not had in this list yet. So one of Path of Peril, just an extra little way to wipe the board if we get in a pinch. Beat Hook Massacre is our main one. This one might be really for the backside, cleave side, and to have that extra hedge against aggro decks. So something to keep in mind. This is something important is the 4 of Rest in Peace. I've considered running some number of Rest in Peace main deck just because of the need for some sort of graveyard hate in the format. But this might be a situation too where Unlicensed Hearse is not very good in this deck because there's nothing really to crew it. We're not really running Manlands, not really running any other things. So really, either Rest in Peace or Kaya maybe needs to be considered moving to the main deck. But outside of that, I think this list is probably going to perform a little bit better for you day one than the other list, mostly because I've played a deck so similar to it for so long that I know how a lot of these interactions work, and especially this package here is something I've played for a good while now. Now that we've looked at the 2 lists that I've been brewing recently, let's take a quick look at. So, a lot of people think Rakdos when they think of Rack, but this is the tier 1 deck in Pioneer right now, according to Goldfish. Now, you always have to take that with a grain of salt because people like playing fair decks when a fair deck is good. So, it might not be literally the best deck in Pioneer, but it's the most winning deck in Pioneer right now. As you can see, this is the list that won the Pioneer Challenge with 8-0. So, I don't think any style of rack deck that I can come up with in Rakdos is going to be better than this deck here. Like it's been play tested so much. So what would happen here is you probably just plug some number of Lilianas in this deck if you want to run a little bit more discardy, and then that's it. The deck's just solid. It's been well thought out. It's designed to beat the format. It's just overall very solid deck. Uh, there's some advantages, like maybe if you want to be more discardy, you play some Kolaghan's commands in the main deck. But just cards like Fable, Blood Tithe Harvester, that engine is very, and they got the 1 of Tenacious Underdog, 4 of Graveyard Trespassers. Those engines are just powerful. They they're the correct speed for Pioneer. So if you're considering Rakdos, I would strongly consider you to look more at the Rakdos mid range decks that have already been played. Now let's take a quick look at the Pioneer meta as a whole. So you have what's Boros aggro. I'm pretty sure this is a heroic deck. So you have the Rakdos mid range is considered the most played right now. So you have Rakdos mid range is the most played. Boros aggro, which is a heroic deck. I'm guessing we'll take a quick look at that too because I'm not entirely sure. Yeah, it's a heroic. Whenever you see favorite hoplite, it's a heroic deck. Illuminator Virtuoso is kind of the new card that's made that style deck playable again. And 10th District Legionnaire is a decent card. It's just solid overall deck. Nothing too crazy special. Homestead Courage with Virtuoso is such a good little combo. Like it's being able to discard it for the value of the flashback too. It's just this is a solid aggro deck. It's probably extremely fun to play too, which is probably why it's seeing a little bit more play than Mono Red right now. But is it Phoenix? There's really we can take a quick look at it, but this is one of the reasons why you have to have graveyard hate in the format, and also for Rakdos Bed Range with their Croxas, and it's less important for them, but it's still good. Croxa can defeat you late game pretty easy if you don't find a way to handle it. But this is the big one, Arclight Phoenix. Ledger Shredder's obviously just a very, very good magic card. The Arclight Phoenix is the star of the show here, but really the underrated cards that you have to hate their graveyard for is Treasure Cruise and Temporal Trespass. Those cards will just win them games because they're 1 mana draw 3, or 3 mana take an extra turn with like Counterspell backup or Spell Pierce backup, or after Sideboard Mystical Dispute backup. It's just very, very underrated deck. I think this might be actually the best deck in Pioneer, in my opinion. It's just a little bit easier to hate out and maybe not as I wouldn't say easy to pilot, but not as like fun maybe to pilot as these first 2 decks are. Like I said, graveyard or Fractus mid range. Really, I'm illustrating here. You need the graveyard hate in your main deck. Mono red aggro. It's pretty simple stuff. It's just you. I'm surprised to see 4F Fanatical Firebrand, but I can see why that's in the deck. This card's one of the cards that's really made red deck wins in older formats kind of see a little bit of a resurgence. It's just very good. It does a lot of things and is a 2/2 for 1 mana. It's an extra thing you have to worry about. Cards like Anax and I was gonna say Embercleave with Anax is really good. So you really have to be able to stabilize against this style of deck in the format too. And if you can't, and if you get stuck under an Eidolon without ways to gain life, this is kind of the big reason why I think Doomrack is a little bit better than the mono black version of discard. Outside of that, Recto Sacrifice, which kind of requires you to need more graveyard hate. Abzan Greasefang, which is, if you don't know how this deck works, it's a Greasefang and Parhelion is the combo. So you have all these cards that kind of just mill over to try to get Greasefang. It either gets back a Chariot or a Parhelion. And if one of those two gets in play, you probably, especially game one, like you almost definitely just lose the game. They're just very powerful cards, and they have the can't stay away to mill over, the Witherbloom commands to mill themselves, and you know kill your 1/1. And this is once again, I think one of the best decks in the format, just because it can do so much. The reason why I don't see it very often in historic, for example, or well, historic or specifically explore when I play arena, is because Seder Wayfinder, for whatever reason, this little card has not been put on arena for who knows why. But this card's like probably one of the most important cards of the deck that enables you to mill, card advantage, and also be able to have a chump blocker to survive until you get your engine going. This card's really dangerous if you don't have graveyard hate. Azorius Control. This is why we have the Pithing Needles. Wandering Emperor can be really good. Since I'm surprised by the 4 sensors, that makes me think maybe they have a Yorion in the sideboard, but I don't see a Yorion, so interesting. So we would be the only Yorion deck in the format as far as I know then. So that surprises me. Usually Azorius Control is more on that. Mono White Humans is just going to be a white aggro deck. Not a whole lot else to tell you on this one. It's just going to be white aggro with Thalia and a couple of that would kind of get some of their value back. Brutal Cathar for removal. Wedding Announcements for grindiness. Brave the Elements is like one of the best spells for a mono white deck that you can run. But pretty easy stuff. These are the types of decks that we have to think of when we're building our deck list. That's something that's really important. You can't just throw a list together because you like that. Oh, like I like the fact that I get to play all these rack cards, and then you don't show up with enough graveyard hate. You try to basically play a burn deck against a burn deck and just get stuck under an Eidolon or get outvalued or get one shot by an Embercleave or opponent starts discarding their phoenixes for value against your unburdened if you're running 4 of those. So you really or vicious rumors. So there's a lot of cards that I think that you just don't play because of the way the meta is. And Rakdos Sacrifice once again is a card that uses the Cat Oven, the graveyard. I believe, as far as I know, it's Cat Oven's not been banned in this format. Yeah, it's still the Cauldron Familiar and Witches Oven combo. So there's a lot of decks that if you're not very prepared for the graveyard, that they are going to just outgrind you if you're a discard deck. So keep that in mind when you're brewing. These 2 decks here are definitely not the pinnacle of what, like I've already said, there's like 2 or 3 adjustments I want to make to this deck, and like 1 or 2 already to this deck just by looking at it again for the second time. I've made both of these earlier this week, so these aren't the pinnacle of what a discard deck in Pioneer will look like, but it is a starting place, and I think they're both solid starting places, and I'm excited to see what the rest of the community does with this sort of archetype going forward. And thank you guys. I know it's been a long one, but I really wanted to break down and analyze what we could be doing in the format to be able to play our favorite type of archetype in multiple formats. And you all have a great day, and Well, I can't tell you to keep racking, but keep discarding people.